We want to fill the space because we're uncomfortable with the silence. We're uncomfortable with the spaciousness. We're uncomfortable with the not knowing. And we're also uncomfortable with the potential because the potential is in the void. So the question I think that we have to ask ourselves is, what can we do to become more comfortable with the silence and spaciousness that is part of nature?
Tracee Stanley, hello. What a treat. Thanks for making it up into the hills of Los Angeles and coming on the Commune podcast. We were neighbors.
Yeah.
We miss you in Topanga.
Oh, thank you. I miss Topanga as well.
You always have a warm pillow, or I guess a cool pillow. You'd probably prefer
a cool pillow. Yeah.
So we were in Mexico recently.
Mm-hmm.
You were teaching at the Wanderlust Palmaya event, and I was experiencing some imposter syndrome as faculty now.
Yeah.
No longer involved on the organizational side, but we had a wonderful time.
It was a great time. Palmaya is a beautiful, beautiful space. I was really happy to be hosted there.
And I think, I know that you teach a whole variety of different modalities, but over the last couple of days, I have specifically immersed myself in your Yoga Nidra teachings. And I've applied them in strange ways, so maybe we'll explore some of those. But just at the basic level, for people who are not aware of the practice, what is Yoga Nidra, and why do we seem to be in such great need of it at this moment?
That's a great question. Yoga Nidra is defined as the yoga of sleep. The word Nidra also comes from two different words, Ni, which means the void, and Dru, which means to draw forth from. So to draw forth from the void. When we think about Yoga Nidra, most of the time, I think we're thinking about a technique, right? It's like we're thinking about, I'm going to get to lie down in a supine position. I'm going to get cozy. Someone is going to guide me through some points in the body. They're going to ask me to soften those points and be aware of those points. And before I know it, I'm going to be drifting off into this really blissful space that feels like a space between being awake and being asleep. And I can hover there for the entire time. And maybe my body is going to fall asleep. Maybe I'm actually going to hear myself snoring. Maybe my mind is actually going to fall asleep, but there's a consciousness, there's something underlying all of it that remains awake and aware. And that is Yoga Nidra. But we can also think about Yoga Nidra as a state of consciousness. And that's really what we're talking about when we speak about Yoga Nidra, is that right now we're hopefully in the waking state. We can move into the dreaming state, deep sleep. Yoga Nidra is said to be this state that is very similar, if not the same, as samadhi. And it's actually a place that is considered to be a place of no thought, a place that's kind of free of fear and free of doubt, where you're connected and remembering your true self.
Yeah, interesting. I've heard kind of in the Taoist tradition, there's a term called Mu Shin, which is sort of without mind. Shin is sort of heart mind in many of the Eastern languages, like Japanese has kokoro, for example. But it's this non-deliberative nature where you are essentially flowing with the river's current. I think this is interesting to explore kind of the more kind of spiritual aspect of Yoga Nidra, but just to hover around more of that liminal space just for a second, because in your books, and I've heard you talk about this, there's some funny stories that you give with I think Edison and Einstein experienced like these kind of moments of Satori in those weird transitional states. So maybe talk about transition and maybe tell those stories for kind of interesting.
Yeah. First of all, I love that you're bringing up transition, because the liminal space is a transition. And you also talked about this idea of the flowing river, I think you just said. It's like the river only flows in one direction, right? Which direction is it flowing in? It's flowing towards the ocean. It's flowing towards the oneness. And when we're in the liminal space, that's where our consciousness is flowing towards. It's flowing towards the oneness. So imagine that these geniuses and artists and inventors knew that there was this space of the liminal. And Matthew Walker talks about this in his book. And then I did more research about it for my book to find out that Salvador Dali, Einstein, Benjamin Franklin, they all had this practice where they would basically hold a metal plate, and there would be like metal balls on the plate, and they would lean back and allow themselves to start to drift off into sleep. And the moment that they hit that like hypnagogic space, the space between being awake and being asleep, what's going to happen is the arm is going to start drifting and the balls fall. And when the balls fall on the floor, they wake you up, and then you start writing.
Yes.
Or you start inventing, or you start drawing. And you're drawing from that place of no mind. You're drawing from that place of being connected. And that was actually something that when I read that, I was like, oh, I wonder if I could write a book from that place. Yeah. And that's where I wrote Radiant Rest, from a lot of that space. It's like I created almost like a circuit training space in my creative space, where I had a place where a rest nest where I would practice yoga nidra. I had my writing desk, I had my harmonium, and I had a hang drum. And I would just go from space to be able to access that creativity. And it just is an amazing thing for anybody who's creative to try.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. There's a number of different threads that I want to pull on. First of all, that idea of, pulling from the void, so from the sunyata, and being, letting yourself create the space such that those gems, that wisdom can come through. Because so often in modern life, we're just filling, doing. There is no space left, there's no conduit. The conduit is already closed down because, we filled it up.
100%.
And I think that if we also think about just the autonomic nervous system and accessing that place of the parasympathetic versus some sort of amygdala hijack or sympathetic overload, which is obviously useful as a biological imperative. But if we think about, when we are in that fight or flight, the aperture of our attention gets very, very narrow, and that's very adaptive, but we feel kind of threatened and we're self-obsessed. When we are able to access that more restful place of relaxation, the aperture of our attention opens much, much wider. And I think that's where creativity can come in.
Absolutely. I think that for our creativity to thrive, first of all, it's not to say that it doesn't thrive in a fight or flight situation, because there may be some gem that comes through from that. But at the same time, for us to be able to just connect to a place within us that is spacious, right? That there is an understanding within us that there's a place that's always at rest. And you said it best, really, is that we're constantly filling the empty time. We're constantly filling the moments in between. You were waiting between meetings, and instead of closing our eyes and just allowing our imagination and our dreaming self to expand, we're going to check the emails, right? So I think the first thing that we need to do, if we're interested in creating spaciousness, is to just make some notes of how we're distracted. What are the things that are the most distracting? How are we filling time? And then if we can start to eliminate some of those things, we start to create more spaciousness in our lives. And then we can have time and space to do practices like Yoga Nidra.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think has become sort of the default state to be chronically fatigued.
Oh, right? Absolutely. And we don't even know how tired we are. That's the first thing that happens when people come on retreat and they're practicing Yoga Nidra is they feel relatively well.
Right.
And then like by day 2 after resting, they're like, wow, I didn't realize how tired I really am.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, it's a good thing that you're on a rest retreat now because there is no doing. The schedule is loose. It's all about you taking the time that you need to be able to actually rest and restore yourself.
Yeah.
But we're all exhausted.
Yeah. And it's funny, it's as if we're operating in a state of mania, like a manic state that is sort of propelling us on fumes. And I think this is just a product of my direct experience of like, I don't take a lot of vacations, but when I do, it's like 3 days in is when I finally just like surrender and let go. And I'm so tired.
Yeah. And then you have 4 days left.
I know, right? You're
right?
like, I gotta go back.
Yeah.
But I want to also just hover over that transition comment, because as I was reflecting about your insights on transition, it reminded me of this book that I read by Paul Hawken, who's an environmentalist. I think it's his book on regeneration. It's at those transition areas from forest to pasture, for example, that are the most fecund and full of wildlife and most efflorescent. So it is very interesting what happens at the transition of things.
Transition is the key in my experience to really healing and to listening to what is needed. And we don't need big transitions. We can think of all the transitions that happen. Most of the time, I feel like when we say transition, people think, oh, I'm getting divorced or I'm changing jobs. And yes, those are transitions. But we've probably had at least 300 transitions since we've been talking. And the most obvious one that we don't think about is the space between the breaths, right? The space between the inhale and the exhale and the inhale. What happens if we start to soften in those spaces and recognize them as little miniature voids? And when we do that, we can also start to notice what is it that we are putting on top of the void. Is it this feeling of fear? Because most of the time a void is kind of, oh, this is the unknown. This is something dark. This is something black. This is something that I don't understand. And instead of being fearful about the unknown, we can think about the unknown as being empty, yes, but being full of luminosity and an opportunity to really understand a little bit more of who we are as human beings.
Yeah, as you're talking, it makes me think about music and the use of emptiness versus the use of notes. It's the melody is actually determined by the space between the notes. And this is always what you're starting with, this experience of infinity, silence. There's very few things that we get to experience as infinity, things with no end, no beginning, no location, no form. So here we have silence, and then we're pulling the notes out of the void. And as a piano player, I've started to try to make more conscious use of silence instead of like, oh man, I gotta fill it up.
Right. But that's what we're taught, right? Is we have to fill it up. It reminds me of the movie Amadeus, where he says, too many notes.
Well, that's a motto for life.
Yeah.
Too many notes.
Too many notes. It's like we want to fill the space because we're uncomfortable with the silence. We're uncomfortable with the spaciousness. We're uncomfortable with the not knowing. And we're also uncomfortable with the potential because the potential is in the void. So the question I think that we have to ask ourselves is, what can we do to become more comfortable with the silence and spaciousness that is part of nature?
Yeah. I mean, this leads me quite naturally into freedom from the fear of death, like the ultimate silence.
Oh, absolutely. It's all abhinivesha. That's what one of the 5 seeds of suffering in yogic philosophy. Abhinivesha is the fear of death. And how many ways are we afraid of dying? Right? It's like we can say, oh, the person is staying longer in the office and they might get my job. If you boil that down, that's the fear of death, fear of getting old. You know?
Yeah, I think that is one of the ultimate targets of the spiritual life is freedom from the fear of death. So let's talk a little bit about the different states of consciousness and how we move through them as we dip into a yoga nidra practice.
Yeah. So the first thing I would say is that it's not a linear process, right? We talk about it because it's easier to understand it as linear.
Yes.
I've had students that it's been their first time practicing yoga nidra and they don't know what to expect. And sometimes that's better. And they lie down and they have this sublime experience of feeling like they're in the void, or not remembering where they were, but knowing that when they came back that they felt blissful. But if we think about it in a linear way, first of all, we're lying down. And we have to remember that yoga nidra is a practice of what's called laya yoga, which is a yoga of dissolution. So it means that we are moving from the most gross to the most subtle with our awareness. And it's also a practice of pratyahara, which means the withdrawal of the senses. And one of the most beautiful definitions comes from Swami Vedabharati, where he says that pratyahara is the withdrawal of the senses so that we can re-assimilate into our true self. And that, to me, is the journey of yoga nidra. So we are going right now from, let's say we're in high beta because we're having a podcast and we have to pay attention to what we're saying, hopefully.
Yeah, we don't, but sure.
But the moment we close our eyes and we start to bring our awareness to our breath, then we're moving more into an alpha state, right? And when we're in that brainwave state, and obviously all the brainwaves are going simultaneously, but a dominant alpha brainwave state, our eyes are closed. And maybe we fall into this place of dreaming, where we start to see images and we start to maybe hear sounds. And at the same time, the teacher or the guide is also guiding you to release the sounds and to release the images and not get caught up in the stories. And then maybe you start to kind of feel, oh, I don't know where my body ends and the floor begins. And I'm starting to feel spacious. And I'm also realizing that I'm thinking at the same time. And maybe I can let go of the thinking. And then maybe I give my body permission to fall asleep. And now I'm in the deep sleep state. And maybe I'm hovering somewhere between theta and delta, in between those places, which is a place of deep kind of healing space, creativity space. And from there, who knows where we go to? Because I feel like when we go into the deepest places of the practice or the technique of yoga nidra, it's almost as though we don't realize it when we're there, but when we wake up from it, there's a fragrance that comes back with us that we realize, oh, I was someplace very deep. I feel more rested than I have in doing a few hours of sleep. You know, maybe there's always been this kind of rumor that started, I think, in the 70s, that doing 45 minutes of yoga nidra is equivalent to 3 hours of sleep. I've never been able to see that proven in any of the studies that I've found. But I think the idea is that within a very short period of time, you can find yourself in a deep state of rest and repose that normally would happen with maybe being asleep for a few hours, going into non-REM deep sleep. So we'll wait, and hopefully someone will come back with the research, but you will feel rested.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think all the best rumors came from the 70s. So as you were describing, there are certain brain waves associated with certain states of consciousness, right? So we have kind of wakefulness, dreaming, sleep, and then the beyond. And how are those correlated with different brainwave states?
Yeah, so beta is basically the wakefulness. So we can say that yoga nidra really starts when you begin to create your rest nest. So you're in beta when you're creating your rest nest. When you close your eyes, you are now being asked to be focusing on your breath. That's moving into this alpha place. And then from there, I don't think that we can say, oh, next you're going to go into delta or theta, right?
As much as we want some linear progression.
Yeah, but when you start to see the images, you probably are moving more into a delta brainwave state. And then from there, the body gets very relaxed, and maybe you lose awareness that you have a body, right? And so we can think about this idea of consciousness being aware on the inside, but the external consciousness is not outside, right? You've withdrawn all of your external consciousness. And then I think that's when we move into those deeper places. And there's research studies that have been done with, great yogi masters around, how the states that they were able to achieve, moving into theta and delta brainwave state, even before they went into the practice of yoga nidra, because that was just their natural state of being, which is amazing.
Right. Yeah. And I suppose we sort of intuitively understood this state prior to being able to measure brain waves, as integrated consciousness or samadhi. Is that the signature there when you're kind of in the deepest place of it? And for me, the best kind of terminology I can summon is that notion of integrated consciousness, essentially the transformation of the feeling that I am an ego self to the feeling that I am interwoven into the fabric of the universe?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because there's said to be this place that's called the fourth, which is beyond the dreaming, the sleeping. And the fourth is this place that is said to be peace beyond words, this blissful state. And the state of yoga nidra is said to be a place of nirvikalpa, so meaning a place of no thought. So that's the interesting thing, is that we are not cognizing where we are when we're in that space. I feel like we only taste it after, because if not, the ego is still there dictating like, oh, I feel blissful. Oh, I feel spacious. So what happens when we let go of the ego? I like to think of yoga nidra as this space where we fall asleep to the ego and we awaken to the soul.
Is that synonymous with this concept of turiya?
I think that it's very close to turiya, but I think that it's hard for us to say that even in this, that something is synonymous, because we're moving into this space of just spacious awareness.
Yeah, nirvikalpa and podcasts don't mesh perfectly. But because we want to put a symbol to these things.
We want to put an explanation to it. We want to put a definition. We want to have a marker that says, oh, I just was in yoga nidra. I made it to Yoga Nidra
Yeah,
now,
we do.
right?
Yeah.
And it's funny because the practice of Yoga Nidra is all about non-doing. So in some ways, we have to let go of those markers and those labels. But at the same time, I feel like the proof is really in how you come back into the world. Mm-hmm. The proof is, are you more aware? Are you more spacious? Are you able to be relaxed and aware at the same time?
Right.
Are you more creative?
Yes, that's how we can sort of experience the alpenglow of this state that cannot be named. I think, obviously there's these traditions like Advaita, or this kind of dissolution of subject-object dualism. Any definition that we will attempt to lop onto it will be awkward and homely. But to the degree that, we can try to put words to mystical experiences, there does seem to be this sense that you are not the distinct feeler of your feelings or the thinker of thoughts.
That's right. You are the freedom. You are the spaciousness. And I do think that we can have an experience of feeling that in Yoga Nidra. That is like, oh, I feel open and wide. I feel like I'm one with the stars. I'm realizing that I'm not separate from nature.
Yeah.
And when we have those kind of realizations, I feel like that allows us to have a different perspective in life. And so if you were to look in the books, it would say that Yoga Nidra is Turiya. Yoga Nidra is the fourth state, that place of nirvikalpa. Now go try and find it.
Ciao. It's funny because I have a very kind of scientific brain, or I'm empirically minded. It's like I want to find the evidence of things.
Right.
This is very kind of post-Enlightenment Western idea.
Yeah.
And then, well, I can know that 8 billion years ago there were supernovas that under unfathomable pressure and temperature, birthed the core elements and then exploded and vomited the guts of these elements all over the universe, which then eventually became, my carbon and nitrogen and phosphorus and oxygen that essentially self-assembled into this organism. And that is the way for me to put a kind of scientific stamp
on the thing.
I am one with the universe.
Yeah. Which is good because it's nice to have evidence. And if we think about the first experiments that were done in the late 70s, early 70s, like 1972, they were done by Alice and Elmer Green at the Menninger Institute with Swami Rama. And they had heard about this Swami who could do all of these things that you weren't supposed to be able to do with your body, like making the temperature of one hand hotter than the temperature of the other hand, stopping the heart and then starting the heart again.
Telekinesis and stuff like that.
Telekinesis and Yoga Nidra. And the idea was that, somebody can actually show that their body is in a full state of sleep, but there's a conversation going on around them. And when they wake up, they can tell you exactly what was said in the conversation. So that means that all external awareness was withdrawn, but somehow there was a consciousness that was still there that was able to hear the conversation. And so this was like the beginning of clinical biofeedback. They were doing these exercises like, the autonomic nervous system is involuntary, but yet there's somebody here who is actually shifting blood pressure and heart rate and being able to go to sleep and still be awake. So that's the first kind of scientific experiments. We can put a link in the show notes if you want.
Yeah, sure.
And then one of his students, I think it was in 2002, maybe a little bit later, wanted to replicate those experiments again. And so Dr. Dean Radin from the Center of Noetic Sciences in California basically said, okay, let's redo these experiments. And when the technician was placing the nodes for the EEG, he was like, oh, wait a second. He's already like vacillating between delta and theta, and he's having a conversation right now with the scientists. So something must be wrong. Let's take everything off, put everything back on. And essentially, this was the state of consciousness that this person was walking around in. So these experiments have been done. There's experiments that they did in Copenhagen with some Yoga Nidra students and teachers just to show what's happening. They put them through, I think it was a PET scan. And so there is something happening while we're doing this practice of Yoga Nidra.
Yeah. The withdrawal from your senses, this practice of pratyahara, it seems so arduous. I mean, I'm not saying for me per se, although at times it is.
Yeah.
But I just think just more generally, because our method of perceiving the world is so based upon our instruments, the instruments that we have available to us, our eyes, our nose, our ears, etc. So how do we begin going about that withdrawal process?
Yeah, so the first way that we do it is we close our eyes, right? We close our eyes and we are automatically withdrawing the sense of sight. We can think about this idea of listening for the furthest sounds that you can hear. Right. And if whoever's listening, just listen to the furthest sounds that you can hear, and then start to let your awareness jump from sound to sound to sound without making a story about the sound. And then eventually just bring all of your awareness to sound closer and closer until the only sound you hear is the sound coming from your speakers listening to this podcast. And then even allow that sound or all the sounds to just be there without focusing on any of the sounds as more important or more defined. And then you're in this space of, oh, there's sound, but I'm not being drawn from this sound to that sound. And then before you know it, you start to release the tastes, you start to release the smells. And you just allow yourself to kind of be in this bubble, this cocoon, if you will, of rest.
So you talk about the koshas. I know sometimes by analogy with the kind of Russian dolls.
Yeah.
That was a good one.
Yeah.
Because it's very visual. People really get it.
Yeah.
Kind of in this process of kind of immersing deeper into this yogic sleep, what does that look like in terms of this unlayering that happens?
I love that you call it an unlayering, because the definition of the koshas are layers or sheaths. And so you can think about this idea that your true self is this amazing, luminous, throbbing light, right? That's effulgent and eternal. And if you're familiar with the Russian nesting dolls, you can think about your true self being inside the smallest doll, and then there's 4 other dolls that are outside. Now, if you're just looking at if you've never seen Russian nesting dolls before, and you just see one sitting on the table, you look at it and it's like, oh, that's the doll.
That's it.
That's who I am.
Right.
I don't realize that there's all these other layers to me. I don't realize that just what's on the outside is actually the physical material, what we would call the food body. And then there's the energy body. And then there's the body that's made up of all the thoughts, the mental body. And then if we keep going, there's this part of us that is a wisdom body. That's the part that all of the artists and all of the scientists and inventors that we were talking about access when they go into that liminal space, is that there's a part of us that is a wisdom body, that's an intuitive body, a space that knows. It's referred to as Vignaya Maya Kosha. And Vignaya, one of the my favorite definitions of Vignaya means to drop out of nowhere, right? And so most of us have probably had an epiphany or an inspiration that has happened when we were running or when we were practicing yoga or we were meditating or just walking in nature, doing something that we felt was joyful, peaceful, and maybe created spaciousness in the mind. And it seems like when that inspiration comes, it drops out of nowhere. And so we have this wisdom body. And then the next body is known as the bliss body. Some of us maybe have been in bliss because we were practicing Shavasana, we were practicing Yoga Nidra, maybe we were making love, maybe that, who knows? But maybe think about the last time that you experienced this feeling of bliss. Where did it come from? But there's still this part of us that's like, oh, I'm experiencing bliss. So the ego is still lurking around there somewhere. And it's not to put a bad rap on the ego because we need an ego. I would not be sitting here if I didn't have an ego. And at the same time, we get to touch a little bit of that light of the true nature of our true self. And that's kind of the journey, again, not linear, but the journey of Yoga Nidra is moving through these koshas, moving through these sheaths of somewhat, we can say illusion in some ways, because a lot of us, I know before I started practicing yoga, I was like, oh, if you ask me who I am, I'll give you all the accolades, all the movies I produced, all the things I've done. And I'm this physical body. And the more that I started to practice, the more I started to realize, oh, wait a second, there's something else happening. There's an energy in this body. There's a vital life force, what we call prana, that is in this body. And I'm also that. You know, I'm also all the wisdom and the thoughts and the things that are swirling around in this body that I'm not aware of unless I find place and time to be spacious.
Yeah. It's so interesting. Also, just, it makes me wonder, I mean, I'm sure we've all had these dreams, you know, where you're speaking a foreign language that you've never spoken before, or playing an instrument virtuosically. If indeed there is, that we experience life as this sort of delegated adaptability, right? There's this kind of like Brahman oneness, and we are all kind of its delegates. You know, it's random modifications, and you know, we get animated for a certain period of time, and we get unanimated, and it selects for the best of us, and then iterates again. You know, but is there a method by which we connect to some sort of intrinsic wisdom that perhaps we just experience in a dream as virtuosic piano playing, even though maybe we're not trained in that? It's an interesting thing to ponder.
I love the question because one of the things that I have noticed, and this is confirmed by people who practice Yoga Nidra a lot, is that they become more aware of their dreams. So we think about Yoga Nidra as this yogic sleep, but it's really sleep to wake you up to your life, to wake you up to the transitions. And one of the biggest transitions that we have is our dream life. Right. And so if you're practicing Yoga Nidra and you're practicing to remain awake and aware, even while the body's sleeping, there's this new level of awareness that happens in the dream state. It can also lead to lucid dreaming. And so as a Yoga Nidra practitioner, I have experienced that my dream life has become very vivid. And I almost feel as though there's like this 24-hour practice that's happening. And then maybe 4 or 5 years ago, I started practicing lucid dreaming. And that's a whole nother window into the soul, I feel like, and into who we really are.
And there's the practice for the practice's sake. And I suppose there's really no delineation between what I'm going to say, but then there's also the way in which it punctuates your daily life.
Yeah.
So as you say, it's kind of what you bring back into your wakeful
That's right.
life that becomes perfumed, as you might say, with some other redolence.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm really interested in, because that's where I spend most of my time, I suppose.
Right.
And maybe this dovetails into, I'm very much a householder, and this is where I am in my life. Quite literally, I still have like 3 daughters that I'm running around with, and time seems to be always fleeting and precious, and so how, for other householders, for people who are maintaining, myriad responsibilities, how does this practice work?
Such a great question. It's one of the things that I talk about in the book called The Householder's Flow. And it is the thing that people are most interested in talking about and doing, which is really this idea that we stop thinking about our yoga practice or any practice really that we're doing as being separate from our life. Meaning that once you step off the yoga mat or once you get out of the yoga nidra nest, that's not when the practice ends. That's really when the practice has just started.
Right.
And so this takes us back to the transitions. It's really being able to be awake in the transitions that allows the householder. And when I say householder, I'm talking about somebody who has the duties of a parent or a caregiver. It's not like you're living in a mountain somewhere and you have someone bring you chai and all you're doing is, practicing all day. Right. I don't know anybody who has that luxury. And so because we're in the real world, if we start looking at those transitions, starting with the transition that we looked at earlier, the transitions between the breaths, we can think about what are the other transitions that I haven't been paying attention to in my life. We can think about the easy transitions of sunrise, of noon, of sunset, and we can decide, okay, I'm going to take 2 minutes every sunrise, every noon, every sunset, and I'm going to just be still for 2 minutes at that time. And then when you start to do that, you start to then see other transitions that happen that you're not even aware of. We talked about this idea of what do you do in the in-between time? So I get emails from people all the time that tell me, oh, I'm waiting, in the car for a soccer practice, and I've just led myself through a 10-minute yoga nidra practice. Because you've been doing the yoga nidra, you've been listening to it, and now you realize, oh, I can self-guide myself in 5 minutes or in 10 minutes to just do a simple body scan, do a simple rotation of consciousness. And if I really am paying attention to the transitions, I realize that within one day, I've actually reclaimed 30 minutes of time. Not all at once. Maybe it's happened in 5 different increments, but I've done 30 minutes of rest practice during my day.
Yeah, I know in one of your books, you talked about some guy that basically transformed his car into his cave. Into
my
his
friend Bill.
Yeah. I was imagining the car dashboard, becoming an altar space or something. And it is really true. It's really possible. Oftentimes we associate these practices, in an environment, in sort of a yoga shala style environment, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But candidly, I've actually experiences of deep relaxation when I'm walking in nature.
That is, walking in nature is absolutely essential for us right now. We are not well because of the illusion of separation from nature. And because nature isn't well, we're not well.
Yeah. In fact, our perception of it as separate creates a hostile relationship between man, air quotes, and nature, such that then we try to subdue it and tame it, and in so doing, it becomes dispensable.
Yeah. And what I hear you speaking to is this idea of human supremacy, right? Is that we think that we're at the top of the triangle or the pyramid, and that is furthest from the truth because we're independent, we're interdependent on each other. And the moment that we think that we're not, and that's what we're thinking, that's what I see people thinking, and organizations and companies and nations thinking that we can just take. So we're in this extractive relationship with Earth. And I think that also mirrors our relationships with people, is that we become extractive and transactional. And it is, it's something that we have to change.
Absolutely. Obviously there's a lot of Western Abrahamic traditions that underwrite this kind of mechanical story. Even in the book of Genesis, where kind of Adam is manufactured, out of a clay, and then blown through his nostril a soul that then animates him. And instead of more of an Eastern kind of organic understanding of the world, of humans growing out of nature. And this is has set up a dichotomy in which we think that we are separate from it.
Yeah. And I'm just thinking about what you just said, because when I think about this body of clay, this is a body of earth. When I think about this soul being blown in, I think about the wind just waking us up. So there's so many different, obviously this knowledge and wisdom has been paramount to indigenous societies for millennia. And that's the thing that we need to be reminded of, because we all have to kind of reclaim our own indigeneity, which is we're all indigenous to the earth.
Yeah.
And we've forgotten that relationship.
Yeah. And these societies that have literally existed for 10,000 years without creating any discernible footprint of essentially living truly in coherence with their ecosystem and environment, and intuitively, and not just intuitively, explicitly understanding that this is a mutually interdependent relationship.
Absolutely. And that there are more beings around than just us. There's so many beings that we don't even pay attention to, that we don't acknowledge, that we, we can go on a whole other podcast for this. Yeah. But what I will say is that how this relates to Yoga Nidra is that Yoga Nidra brings you back to the understanding, the knowing of your true self. And in that knowing of your true self, you remember your connection to Earth. You remember Earth as the great mother that can hold you. And instead of just saying, oh, I want to go into nature and I want to feel good and I want to practice Yoga Nidra on the earth and let the earth hold me, what else can I give back to Earth? What else can I give back? How can I create this relationship to be reciprocal and to actually cultivate a relationship? And I think that's one of the many things that Yoga Nidra really wakes you up to.
Yeah. Yeah, it is this. We were talking a little bit before we started recording around the different impetus that underwrite this or kind of scaffold the feeling of self. And, I was telling you about, I threw my back out on Monday and have sort of strangely applied yoga nidra to back pain. We can maybe talk about that for a second. But it is this kind of seizing and clutching of, in this particular case, my lower back muscles, and then the subsequent experience of pain that really anchors me in this feeling of a separate self. But that is a phenomenon related certainly to pain, but it also is a phenomenon very much related to any form of kind of stress or trauma or clutching, and it's very endemic to a society that's always kind of chastising you or admonishing you or telling you, just try harder, Tracee. Just try a little bit harder. Focus focus, Tracee. Try hard. And, and in all of that, I mean, literally, as I say it, I'm clutching, I'm flexing my muscles. And just that underwrites, there's a sense of like when I'm doing that, or when your plane hits turbulence and it goes, shoo, and you go, ugh. Yeah. That's when you feel most separate. Yeah. And I think we sort of have a pandemic of separateness.
Oh, yeah. I mean, we can, so two things come to mind is like when I'm seeing you clutch yourself like that, it's like, oh my God. But the question that we can always ask ourselves is, once we kind of attune to, oh, I'm holding my breath, or I'm clutching my muscles, or I'm holding this tightness that there's no reason for me to be holding right now. So the question that I like to ask myself is, what am I holding on to that is not life affirming? Mm-hmm. Right? What am I holding on to, whether it's in the form of a thought, in the form of who I think I am, in the form of like, what am I holding on to in my body right now? And then I think the other thing is that we're in the situation that we're in the world, with all of the wars that are currently happening, with all of the polarization that is happening, because we are under the illusion that we are separate. And the separation doesn't come first from me thinking that I'm separate from you. It's really because I think I'm separate from nature. When I realize that I am nature, that, as Thich Nhat Hanh says, the consciousness of nature is my consciousness, then things will shift. But I think we're a long way from that. And I think the more that we can be with nature, try to cultivate a relationship with nature, walk in nature, in silence, in spaciousness, lay down and let yourself be held, those things will come, those realizations will start to unlayer themselves little by little. At least that's been my experience.
Yeah, just my experience over the last few days since my back went out. The first day there's like tremendous spasming and clutching, and I'm in bed. And I'm sort of not, I'm fighting it, right? I'm in a battle with my back. And then I actually started to get into the yoga nidra practice, and I was like, okay, I'm going to get up. I'm going to start to move, because I know that my body really wants to heal. It wants to let go. So I have to, swim with the river's current here. And so I started to walk very, very slowly, very intentionally, just like feeling the ground underneath my feet. And then kind of focusing on the area of discomfort and breathing into that space, and then just like blowing out, like letting it go, letting that clutching go. And it was totally game changing. And I don't know, like I said, if yoga nidra has been really very much applied to like specific physical pain. But it was almost a trance state that I was in of super relaxation. And in it, I actually realized how much of my life is spent clenched, because like the pain is sort of like in my lower back, but sort of radiates over kind of into the psoas, into the front. And like most of the time when I walk, I realize that like my stomach muscles are super tight and engaged.
Yeah.
Not because I'm trying to show off some six pack, but just like that is kind of feels like how I've been trained to be, kind of on alert. And I was like, no, make yourself like a big fat yoga belly, like just like a big, and just like, ah. And it was like, whoa, there was space there. And it was, it provided a lot of relief.
So you just gave a perfect example of how the wisdom of Yoga Nidra unfolds. You said, I had this realization of how I'm living my life, how I'm holding my body. That is exactly what we were talking about with the Vignaya Maya Kosha. It's like, oh, a knowing and understanding comes out of nowhere. And then that also leads you back to the Manamaya Kosha, the mental body, which you said, oh, there's something that says be on alert all the time, right? So that you're now aware of this thought construct that is like, be alert. And you're able to then go and say, okay, let me start to release or soften this be alert, because the be alert doesn't ever let you rest. The be alert doesn't ever let you, quote unquote, let your guard down. So instead, you're walking around guarded all the time. And if we were to, let's say, do the timeline practice from my book, The Luminous Self, we would go back in time and we would trace back to when was the very first time that you heard or felt this idea that you needed to be alert. And maybe be alert was like really necessary at a certain point in time, but it's been carried forward through your life and it was time to maybe let it go a while ago. But now you know. And so now you have the opportunity to release it and maybe even create an antidote to be alert that you start to bring into those transitions in your day to remind yourself, it's safe for me to soften. And so that becomes a practice that in the transitions in the car or in the between leaving the podcast studio and walking back to your home, it's like, oh, it's safe for me right now. It's safe enough, as my dear friend, Dr. Chanti would say, it's safe enough right now for me to soften, to let my guard down.
Yeah. I think that is one of the greater challenges for a lot of people, particularly marginalized people, to feel safe. Of course, you can't even really build healthy relationship outside of safety and security for reasons that we discussed earlier. If you feel as if you are under threat at all times, you become incredibly distrustful of the world around you.
Absolutely.
And it is very hard to attune or establish, heart coherence or relatability when you're in that place of clutch and flex.
Yeah, this is why I think spaces for people who are marginalized, people who have been underserved, people who have been ignored, is really important for people to be able to gather in affinity spaces where they can feel safe. And we also have to acknowledge that there's no such thing really as a safe space. As many candles and bells and things that we want to add to the class and the incense and whatever else to make it look cute and feel safe, what's safe for me is not necessarily safe for you. right? And so part of our work is to understand how we can feel protected. What can we bring in to protect ourselves, to make ourselves feel safe enough, right? Which would mean maybe for me, doing Yoga Nidra is keeping my eyes slightly open, is leaning up against the wall, is practicing with my pet or my dog in the room. You know, there's different ways in which you can bring in a sense of safety. And I think the biggest thing is really knowing that you're worthy of rest.
Yes.
That's really the biggest thing for everybody in whatever body you're in.
Yeah. I mean, I know many, many people, and it's honestly beat into sort of the tradition of the American dream, is you're going to work hard, you're going to work even harder, and you're going to provide a better life for your children than you had. And obviously that is a more arduous, onerous task for some people than others, given the way our society is set up. So there are people that have grown up with the monotone message of you need to be 5 times as good.
Well, there's so many things we can talk about. We can talk about the I'll rest when I'm dead mentality.
Right.
We can talk about if you are a descendant of enslaved people, that you probably have something within you that feels like my life is in danger if I'm actually caught resting. Because if you were enslaved and you were quote unquote owned by someone, you were a product and you didn't get to rest. So that lives for sure in my DNA, right? And many other people's DNA. And then there's also what you just said. It's like, I have to be 100 times better than someone else to get the same opportunity as the other person, right? Or there's too much to do. I never saw anybody in my family rest. So that means that I don't deserve to rest either. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of things we can tell ourselves, but I think the biggest thing we need to do is really ask ourselves, who modeled rest for us? And maybe answer the question of what is the legacy that we want to leave behind? If we want to create a rested world, a rested lineage, how would we begin that? Yeah.
It's so interesting. I'm still learning from my betrothed. Skylar and I, we've been together for 36 years now. It was just her birthday, so I've been reflecting on it. And she said something at this dinner a few weeks ago that really just took me by surprise, candidly. I think I can't remember what the prompt was, but we do these prompts and go around the table sometimes at Topanga. And it was something like, what are you most proud of? And her answer was, breaking the cycle of trauma in my family.
That's something to be proud of.
And I was like, whoa. Because I hadn't ever heard her articulate it like that. And it was reflective of like a really deep mission or purpose to her life that was unveiled to me 35.8 years in. It was like, wow. And, you know, I've heard you talk about, you know, trauma and our issues and our tissues. In what particular ways can the practice address sort of like deeply embedded trauma, and how do we use it to break these cycles of trauma?
That's a good question. You know, what I would say is this is a practice that will reveal to you so many things about thought constructs. Memories can come forward. Knowings can come forward. It's one of the reasons why if you are suffering from trauma, PTSD, complex trauma, it's a good idea that when you're practicing Yoga Nidra, that you also have a really great therapist or mentor to help you to integrate and process what comes forward. because a lot of what you were just talking about, this kind of holding on that happens when you start to create the spaciousness, things become less dense and they become easier to see and sometimes easier to feel. And so what I would say is that Yoga Nidra does give you capacity to be able to hold things that you might not have been able to hold before, because you realize that those things are not you, right? And that they don't define you, and that there's a part of you that is actually kind of separate from all the things that happened to you, right? That there's a part of you that is beyond all sorrow, as it says in the Yoga Sutra 136. And this is part of the work that Richard Miller is doing, part of the work that he's been doing with veterans, is how Yoga Nidra is really efficient for PTSD. And I can't say that that this is like a monolith of a practice, right? Because it's going to be different for everyone. But I definitely feel like Yoga Nidra helps you to tune in, to touch, to know the part of you that is really eternal, that is beyond all the conditioning.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we become pretty anchored to the stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves.
That can happen.
Yeah. And I have all this personal folklore, some of which is candidly bullshit.
Right.
But that I, lug around in a rucksack about my own life.
Yep.
And then, you do get these openings, these moments of like, no, wait, I am not that story. And I find this to be a fascinating way to just sort of unlayer that, right? So, what are some very simple prompts or practices if people just want to do this? And obviously you have all sorts of resources, which, I hope you can direct people to. But even just here, if there's, some very, very simple prompts for people who are listening.
Yeah, I would say that first, kind of let yourself remember the breath. Let go of the idea that you need to extract or to take a breath, and just be in a place where you might kind of soften the forehead or the temples or the jaw, the eyes and eyebrows, the throat, the shoulders, and just feel that wave of softening moving from the top of the head all the way to the tip of the toes. And as you are allowing that to happen, you actually maybe begin to feel that you are receiving a breath. And when you receive the breath, just remember that you are worthy of this receiving. And notice if there's any thoughts that are to the contrary. And just name those thoughts, write them down, and then really sit with, are they really true? Are you ready to shift that kind of thinking and to be in an acceptance that because you are here in this moment, you're worthy not only of the breath, but you're worthy of rest. And again, go back to that question of who modeled rest for me? What were the ideas and thoughts that I was given around rest? Was it seen as valuable? Was it seen as something that was lazy? Am I ready to shift that? And then just going back to kind of Skylar's question, that's also a similar thing that's in my book, is what is the legacy you want to create? And how would you begin? If there's a new legacy that you want to create for your lineage, how would you start? And rest is definitely a great way to begin that. Intentional rest, practices like Yoga Nidra, deep relaxation.
So for people who are wondering whether or not it's truly possible to experience life in a more restful way? I mean, we hear about like Mataji or Rama or Satyananda, or, these great rishis and sages. Like, I can't be. I'm not a sannyasin. I'm a householder. I'm not a forest dweller or whatever. I'm curious where you find yourself in that journey. I mean, do you get aggravated and annoyed?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And do you feel like you're operating in life kind of in that theta state, some delta state sometimes, or are you vacillating? What's it like to be Tracee Stanley?
Well, first of all, I have no idea what the brainwave states are.
Yeah.
What I can say is that I live a life that honors the transitions. I try to pay attention to the transitions, and I try to drop a little bit of something sacred into the transitions through my day so that my whole day becomes like a sacred ritual. That for me is what life is. It doesn't mean that I'm not going to get into an argument with my beloved. It doesn't mean that I won't get aggravated in traffic, but it does mean that I bring a sense of presence to everything that occurs as much as I can. And that in retrospect, when I forget, I try to go back in time and say, okay, what could I have done differently? How more present could I have been? What would a different outcome have looked like if I had been more present? I practice yoga nidra every day. When I'm creating my schedule, I don't create a schedule that is already giving me anxiety because I'm overscheduled, right? I think about the things that I say yes to, right? It's like, because there's also this idea that, if you don't say yes to everything, you're going to miss out on an opportunity. So I kind of let go of this idea of missing out, because that to me is the overculture telling you that you're not enough. You're going to miss out if you don't do this. It's your last chance. You have one more day to do whatever it is. And I just allow myself to ask the question, is this life affirming? Is this meeting that I'm going to have with Jeff Krasno today, is it life affirming? I know it's going to be life affirming because I know you and I know that what you stand for, right? And so that's a question that I ask myself. Is this something that's going to feel draining for me to do? Is this person or this company, does this feel extractive? Because if it feels extractive and it feels transactional, it's a no for me. And so I think that all of us have to create these kind of boundaries to protect our energy and to really know what it is that we want from life.
So good. So helpful. I'm going to ask you about social media then and your relationship with it, because I think it's so ubiquitous and it's an area that doesn't have a lot of guidelines to it, candidly. So I don't think people have particularly healthy relationship with it generally. How do you manage your relationship with Instagram, TikTok, etc.?
Well, first of all, I don't have TikTok.
No one might soon.
That's the first thing. The other thing I would say is we have to be aware that we are not our Instagram account. If tomorrow somebody pressed a button and Instagram was gone for everybody, the question that I would ask is, how are you feeling about that?
Yeah.
Because it's going to happen one day where there's going to be something that there's no Instagram, and you have to realize that that is not who you are.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So
it's actually really funny. There was some malfunction. Instagram always has some buggy thing going on with it. So I was in there the other day on my account and I clicked into like the dashboard, I think, a personal dashboard or something. And it said that I had just lost 40,000 followers. And then I had to kind of witness my own reaction to it. And I was like, first of all, I was like, that can't be. what have I done? What have I said? But it was actually pretty interesting because like the first thing that came up was like, oh, well, that was a lot of sunken hours.
Yeah. I wouldn't say I'm more enlightened, but I would definitely say that I don't feel like I am my Instagram account.
Yeah.
I love pictures. I love connecting with people. And I also think that we need to kind of reclaim some power away from some of these companies. And if people are really wanting to know what it is that we're doing, or, I sign up for somebody's mailing list, right? Because I want to know what they're doing or what they're offering. And that to me, and yes, I like to look at what people are doing on Instagram, what my friends are doing. But I also know that one day it's not going to be there.
Right.
And it could happen in a moment.
Yeah.
So we have to know who we are.
What do you love doing more than anything right now?
What I love doing is walking with nature, being in the forest, walking next to a river, hiking on the land that I'm stewarding. That's being in nature is like my favorite thing to do.
And you've architected your life such that you can do that pretty often?
I have. Yeah. I mean, I moved from Topanga, as you know, to northern New Mexico so that I could be in a little bit more of a vaster landscape with less people and more natural surroundings.
Yeah. I just reread Siddhartha, the Herman Hesse book.
Yeah. I haven't read it in a long time. But
I hadn't read it in a long time either. Do you know, Murray Hidary, right? He's
No.
a piano player who does these wonderful piano meditations. Anyways, I think he's like composing some like opera to Siddhartha.
Oh, that sounds amazing.
It sounded amazing. And he was like, oh my God, Jeff, you got to go revisit that book. So I did. He was in Mexico too. And I recently did. And it's wonderful. I really recommend that people go back to that book because there is a significant part of that book related to sitting by the river and learning from the river.
That's what it's all about.
And it's described in such wonderful detail.
I'll have to go back and reread that.
Yeah, and it was like, I got to go find a river stat.
Yeah.
But obviously the river could be, it could be, a trail. It could be anything, but it's essentially listening.
Yeah. Nature is the teacher.
Yeah.
There's so much for us to learn, not only about nature, but about ourselves.
Are you writing another book?
I am going to be writing another book.
Okay.
Yeah.
You're going to be coy about it?
Right now, I'm going to be coy about it.
Yeah, fair enough.
But nature will be a prominent feature in the book.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, hopefully you'll come back and talk about it.
I would love to.
Where else can we find you in the great big world?
Oh boy. You can find me, best place to find me is on my website, TraceeStanley.com. Mm-hmm. Yeah. All the things are there.
All the goodies are
there.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Tracee. That was great.
Thank you so much, Jeff.
I really enjoyed it.
Me too.
And my back felt really, I didn't even really know it was there.
That's a good sign.
That's a good sign. Thanks.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks a lot for watching. If you enjoyed this video, then I think you'll love this one too.